they had a great celebration a few weeks ago there. So, Bill, it's a great privilege to have you here, and Bill's got lots and lots of pieces of paper and documentation that he's going to share as he goes through, and so it's over to him. We'll have our break around 10 to 5 to 8 for 15 minutes or so. Now, there are books for sale, and the FPOS machine is available. Pastor Bill will talk about some of those books as he goes. So, Bill, it's over to you.
Thank you. So good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. Excuse my voice. I flew in from Papua New Guinea on Monday with acute diarrhoea, and then yesterday picked up a wog in my throat because I had to go to Sydney for 2 days. I've just flown in like Mike, so I'm a little bit had it. So I'm giving an excuse for before I even start. But it is a joy to be here and to share with you. Particularly a topic that is, I guess, dear to our hearts, our movement and its origins. I'll refer to, I think, the best way for you to understand the movement is to read Leo Harris's books and his sermons, but basically he wrote them up into six books, and this is in legacy. I don't even know what the price is, but all of his material is here. Also, what we've done is produced 5 Keys of Authority as a study guide, and I gave a copy of these to all of the heads of the Pentecostal movements just today as a gift, and to say, you know, this is our founder, his life story. And what I love about 5 Keys is it came out of frustration, pain, sense of inadequacy that he faced as a young man, at 29 years of age in 1949 through to probably 37, 38 in the late 50s. He had 5 crises, and you can read the story here, and it's a very thin book, and he outlines it out of crisis, out of inadequacy, out of a sense of his own poverty, spiritual poverty, crying out to God. The Lord gave him revelation, insight, and these are the 5 Keys of Authority. And really, all CRC pastors have got this, and I've got my original copy from 1971 that I got. It's dog-eaten, it's noted in different colours, and I basically, in my early years in preaching, I just preached every one of these chapters in the book. I would pinch Barry Chant's messages, I'd hear him, I'd hear Pastor Harris speaking, and the book, and so in the first couple of years, I just shared all of this material, so I kind of know it inside out. But I would encourage you, if you really want to know about the spirit and heart of the founder of this church, then legacy is crucial. The other one is we asked our national chairman back in the late 1980s, Pastor Dudley Cooper, to do the official for the 40 years or 50 years, 50 years, 1995. He actually checked out all the archives and all the magazines and put together Flames of Revival, which is a documentary history of the CRC from the early 1940s. And it's a really interesting read. So again, this one is Dudley Cooper, who was one of the pastors here. He started the Rosewater Church, Port Life. He was involved in Port Lincoln. He was involved all over the place, and one of Pastor Harris's associate pastors. When I got saved, Dudley was one of the team, and we loved him. Beautiful man and wonderful wife and kids, and so he wrote this, and it's very good. It'll get you right in on what happened from the early 40s right through to 1995, basically. So that one's there as well. And I have, Nathan has sent a stack of my books, but the one that's probably most relevant would have to be Revival is Our Middle Name, which we published in 2000. And it incorporates some of the key messages, strategic messages that I've given at our national conference since 2000 or so. And it's really about personal revival, local church revival, and denominational revival. So the messages I selected were geared to say, help us understand the New Testament picture of revival, and particularly from a CRC perspective. So that's there as well, and there's other bits and pieces there. Now, you've received a one-page outline? Sorry? Oh, it's on its way. Okay. All right. The printing machine has gone on strike, has it? So those books, I think, if you really want to get into it, they'll bless you. My perspective, as Pastor Neil said, I came to Christ here in 1971. Before this building was here, it was Crusade Hall. And so in the midst of the Jesus movement. And so if you've seen the film, The Jesus Revolution, and what started in the United States and Calvary Chapel in Southern California spread right across America, Europe, Australia. So we had hundreds, perhaps thousands of young people from probably late 60s, early 70s, mid 70s that came to Christ. I mean, the youth ministry here would attract 400 people on a Saturday night. Young people, and they're getting saved, whole pile getting saved. It was an amazing time. And so I came to Christ here, and under Pastor Harrison, loved him dearly. Ended up living at Sunrise House with Hans Vortman. Both of us were there for 3 months, and doing a whole pile of spiritual and practical work. So we got to know Pastor Harrison, Mrs. Harrison, and we had a bird's eye view of their marriage. Learned a few things, and so if you knew Mrs. Harris, she was an unusual lady, and we loved her deeply, but to see that up close and personal, it's kind of took the shine off a little bit to say, oh, okay, he's a normal man, and she's a normal woman. And so, but it was an interesting exercise being out there and living on the property, and then associating with seeing them at work and that. So my own journey was I was here for 7 years, and I've only ever been in 2 churches in my life, this one and the one I'm pastoring. And so I was here for 7 years, did Bible college with my mate over there, and can't believe it was 53 years ago that we went to Bible college. And I was in a taxi in Sydney, and this guy, I'm talking to him, and he said to me, oh, nobody talks to me as a taxi. You're the only one you're the first one that's been talking to me for a long time. And I said, oh, okay. So we talked, I shared, he's an Indian man and Hindu, and shared a bit about faith. And I said, I've got a 21-year-old granddaughter. He goes, no. I'm like, yeah. He goes, I said, well, how old do you think I am? He goes, 55. And I said, you're going to become my best friend. And so as a young guy from here, I stayed and was involved in revivals in schools. And so the school I was at in Underdale High School, we had a significant revival. It was a Book of Acts revival, really. Everything you see in the Book of Acts happened there. And at the end of the year, I just felt, heck, I could do this for the rest of my life. I like this stuff, seeing people saved and getting baptised in water, baptised in the Spirit, getting healed, delivered, forming small groups and teaching, and it was just wonderful. And then I had to make a decision of what do I do with my life, my career. My mother was saying, you've got to go to university, Greek women, we're working class people, we've worked like dogs. You're going to go to university. I don't want to go to university, Mum. So we had a significant discussion, and so God called me, and as I'm seeking Him in just prayer and fasting, I just turned 19, January 1993, and God called me into ministry. He spoke to me very, very clearly, 4 bits of information that really set the trajectory of my life. And I brought it up one day because it's an amazing story. Anyway, I went to university, and I went to Bible college at the same time. And when I graduated from university, the point I want to get to is Pastor Harris had a key role in me making a decision for ministry, because I'd finished uni, finished Bible college, and so I had a beat up old, and so they offered me a job in a really good high school, and so I'm thinking, yeah, I'll get it. I'll get some money. I can date my girlfriend and buy buy myself a decent car. And so I basically said, yes, I would take the job. And then I thought, I better pray about it. So to the Lord, and I got a very distinct no. What? How do I explain that to my mother? You know, they supported me for 4 years at uni, and I felt a distinct no. And one of the pastors here, beautiful man, he kind of put me off a little bit, saying, well, Bill, you've got to earn some money, you've got to get a job, you've done 4 years uni. And I felt the Lord saying, no, I want you to teach a registration and lead revivals in about a dozen high schools, like you did at Arndale High. And the students, year 11, 12 students from here, I got into a working group, prayer group, and got them to, they did all the work, and I would actually go. And but to make the decision, we had to track Pastor Harris down. It was over where he was, but because, you know, my parents were saying one thing, one of the pastors here was saying another thing, and so then we tracked him down and told him what I felt the Lord say to me, and, you know, all that. And I still remember what he said, and this kind of speaks of the man's faith and the heart. He's 23 years of age, and he said, Bill, if you prayed and you sought the Lord and he said to do this, he goes, you do it. And what hit me was, he actually believes in me. He believes that God can speak to a skinny Greek kid who's got a lot of problems, and I just felt like $1 million. He actually believes it. He could see faith in people and recognise the call of God. And so I made that decision and finished cleaning toilets for 6 months and evangelising schools. Can you believe it? You know, 2 degrees and a diploma. I was the most well-educated toilet cleaner in the world.
Just hold it like that. Cover that.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah. And but the point was, that just reveals Pastor Harris's heart for people. He could see the spirit of faith. He could see the call of God, and in his life. I remember Barry Silverback saying when we talked once, we said, yeah, that's the thing that really inspired us. He could see faith at work in people, and of course he inspired a generation to believe God, to trust God. You read Your Faith is Power, and to go out and evangelise and plant churches and do this stuff. And so this became the largest Pentecostal church in Australia for about 20 years, from 1957 through to probably 75. And out of here, there were dozens and dozens of churches that were planted, people that were inspired, did training. So this is a significant ministry. And then he suddenly went to be with the Lord in 1977. We could not believe it. I was leading a youth group. We were going to meet at his house. That's right, we planned it. We planned to go to his house, and that would be the place where we'd leave and go. And I get the telephone call that he died. Well, I just thought they were joking. I couldn't believe it, you know, this fit man, you know, really. And that caused that changed a lot of things in the church here and within our state of South Australia, the CRC, and across Australia. It was a significant, great interruption, something we didn't expect. And it's what we call, from 1977 to about 1985, some of us nicknamed it the dark years. It was a difficult period for the church here, and also for our CRC movement. And I'll explain that. When the notes come, you can't find them. Okay, no worries. All right. I'm not bound by my notes now. So let me just say that we are a fervently evangelical Pentecostal movement. We're Protestants. We're not Catholic. We're not Orthodox. We're Protestants, but we're firmly Pentecostal in all of our beliefs. And if you don't know what those beliefs are, then the charter that I have here, I'll give it out a bit later, actually outlines what our doctrinal position is, our set of beliefs. And so And so we are fervently Pentecostal, and I believe fairly unique, even across the Pentecostal scene. So meeting with the heads of Christian church, the heads of Pentecostal movements for 2 days. We meet actually once a year for 2 days, and it's actually a very good meeting, and we're able to share together. And so everyone knows of Leo Harris, everyone knows of the CRC and its input. And so we're now 80 years old as a movement. So I think the Assemblies of God are just a few years older than us, and the Apostolic Church is probably a few years earlier than us as well. So let me just make a couple of comments about movements, and then we'll specifically talk about some of the historical stuff with the CRC. New Christian movements, when they start, in fact, when I was at university, I had to do sociology, and it was the most boring subject. Like, I had to do psychology 1 and philosophy 1, and they weren't too bad. I had to do sociology 1 as part of my education degree. It was just dead dog boring, except for one lecture. And my eyes were open, and it got me reading and studying. It was when, during the Protestant Reformation, there were a whole pile of different groups that started. And so all these little groups, they're actually called sects. And I always thought the name sect was like a cult, weird. But no, it's actually a sociological term of a new religious group. And the common features of it is it started by an incredibly charismatic leader, okay? And so they don't start on their own. It becomes, you know, the person's incredibly gifted, very charismatic, or is the whole movement is actually driven by the person's charisma and giftings. And sometimes there's an unbalance that goes there, an adulation to the leader that's a bit unhealthy. And certainly for Leo Harris, we really respected him and loved him dearly. But he didn't, you know, he was a humble man as well as being a man of faith, but he was incredibly charismatic. The team that was here in the Sturt Street Church was united when he was alive. So they were committed to serving under him because of his charisma, because of his character, because of his anointing. When he died, that fell apart. There were 3 political parties that developed. And it's as bad as the Labor Party and the Liberal Party. And the Nationals and One Nation. It was 3 groups, and they were vying who's going to take on the church. And as far as the people were concerned, there was only one person that really should have been the leader. It was obvious. There was a terrible division that occurred among the eldership team. And sadly, you know, there was a group of elders that were older men, and they were fantastic in the 1950s and early 60s, but they really should have been moved out and other leaders come in. And so seriously, a couple of them said, no, we want the family to control the church. It'll be the son-in-law, and then his child, who's only a baby, will become the pastor after him. Can you believe that? They actually said that. I nearly fell over. I thought, what the heck? This is the worship of the leader, the charismatic leader. And so the church went through a difficult time. If a church, let me put this down here. A sect can easily become a cult or a responsible denomination. There's a natural transition. So when you study the Reformation period in the 1500s, there were many denominations that were formed, but there were also groups that became cultish. And so the sect can become a cult, or it can transition into a responsible denomination. The big difference is this, is that in the initial period, it's led by a charismatic leader, okay? But for it to become a new movement that's going to last, it's got to become charismatic in its vision, and that means the whole group has to become vision driven, and that's, you know, and if that doesn't happen, and that means that there's a group of leaders that evolve, okay, men and women that actually end up leading it. If it becomes a cult, is the family take it over, okay? The family take it over. It becomes very humanistic, or the leader becomes very dictatorial. So Leo wasn't dictatorial, just that we respected him so much that his way and his will, you know, we submitted to him, and thankfully he was a man of the word and a man of integrity and didn't lead us off a cliff. But other groups dissolve and they become cultish, or they become denominations. And so the CRC, for the first 32 years, was led by the charismatic leader. And then it's been how many years now? 50, 40, 49, 50 years since then. And so the movement transitioned in 1977 for a period of about 8 years, what we call, it was a dark period. The only real effective light that was what was happening in Papua New Guinea. There was a revival taking place, and an amazing revival. I was here the Sunday where we commissioned Barry Silverback, 1970, late 71, early 72, I forget now. I didn't know much then, but you know, they commissioned, they said, you know, I knew that he'd been in the Eastern Highlands for 3 years, came back for a period of time and then commissioned to, and so we followed Barry and what was happening, the revival that occurred there. But within Australia, we had a great difficulty. It doesn't mean that things weren't happening. For example, the Christian Family Centre was birthed in 76 and 77, around that time. And so there were churches that were being planted and that. But organisationally, the viability of the movement was really threatened as such. We finally got the notes, have we? Praise the Lord. I've got one. I've got my own. And so, if you look at the notes, I'm starting off by, I've given you the resources about new movements. New religions in the first generation, around 40 years, are usually started by a really gifted, charismatic leader. There's Leo Harris, 32 years. For a new movement to become a charismatic movement, not just led by a charismatic leader, it needs to, as it moves into its second generation, so from 40 to 80 years. Okay, now we've just celebrated our 80 years, and now we're heading for the next generation to go to at least 120 years. It needs to have a clear, communicable vision, okay? A definite set of core values and a purposeful, achievable strategy. That's the common features of when it actually becomes a movement. And it also, I didn't put it in there, it needs to have a definite body of biblically based doctrines. Okay, new movements usually have clarified certain doctrines. So if you study Lutheranism, Wesleyanism, Calvinism, their understanding of Scripture, they have a very clear body of belief. And the CRC has that in our Declaration of Faith. So a definite body of biblically based doctrine. And so when, in Leo's day, the statement, the doctrinal statement was really just a few lines. And so since that time, we've developed it into a very clear doctrinal statement of faith that the whole movement has accepted. And we got our top theologians, Barry Chant, Ken Chant, Mark Walker, Ian Miller, a couple of others, to form a subcommittee to take what was there in the beginning and to flesh it out. And so now in the Charter you'll see a very clear doctrinal statement, which is Protestant, Evangelical, Pentecostal. And you know, for example, we don't apologise for that. I've had people wanting to join the movement who don't believe in water baptism by immersion. Well, they can't actually become ordained pastors within our movement if they don't accept that. Or they say, oh, speaking in tongues is only one of the evidences of baptism in the Spirit. And so we say, well, actually our body of doctrine says no, that glossolalia is the normal initiatory evidence, so you can't be a CRC pastor. So we've defined it. So in the early stages, people's loyalty is to the leader. When it becomes a denomination, there has to be a body of doctrine, a set of beliefs that bring unity. There has to be a clear, communicable spiritual vision. For example, or maybe I'll give this out now so you can see there's just the charter, yeah. Well, I refer to it, and so this evolution from where we were in 1977, by I'll just rub, if we've got a rubber, I'll rub that off now. And don't need this anymore. Got the notes. So from 1945 to 1977, there was no statement ever produced to outline the vision of the movement. There was no defined core values. Yet everyone knew what the CRC was on about. Why? Because Leo Harris personified the vision and the values. And so it was built around his charisma. But he's gone. Most of our pastors now in Australia didn't know him. Most did not know him. And that's why it's important to codify. If a movement's going to move from being a sect into a denomination, it's got to have a set of beliefs. It's got to have a clear vision. So we never had a vision statement. So in 2000, and there were different presentations of vision. I'm not saying we didn't have vision, but to actually define it, we went through a process in the early 2000s, and we kind of surveyed the movement, the national executive and other leaders, subcommittees, basically put a lot of thinking into this process. So if you want to have a look at the charter, and that's why we say, I know in our church we have the charter as well as our own documentation, the Christian Family Centre, who we are. So new people coming in can say, okay, this is who we belong. If you look at the charter, point number 3, our vision and mission. We finally, I'm covering it over again. Our vision is to help expand the kingdom of Jesus Christ on earth by creating Bible-based contemporary local churches and ministries. That's the big picture, okay, is to expand the kingdom of Jesus on earth by creating Bible-based and contemporary. So it's the scriptures, our foundation, but we are modern in the sense of churches that relate culturally. And then it says, in this definition, the mission actually opens that up. So if you look at the mission, our mission is to exalt Jesus in all that we think, say, and do, and to extend his influence throughout the world. So you notice the wording, expand the kingdom of Jesus under vision. Our mission is to exalt Jesus and to extend his influence throughout the world in 4 ways. Proclaiming Christ's gospel, and again, notice Christ's gospel with the expectation that supernatural signs will follow as the normal New Testament pattern. 2, planting Christ-centred churches that are autonomous, interdependent and self-propagating. Thirdly, promoting Christ-glorifying Christian communities which outwork the miraculous and character-transforming ministry of the Holy Spirit. And fourthly, producing Christ-following disciples who seek to obey the Great Commandment and the Great Commission. So there's 4 aspects to the vision, and we call that the mission. So it actually so that lays the foundation of why we exist. What's our purpose? And then we put down the core values, which I still remember the discussions we had, many hours. And we read all of Leo's material. We read through revivalists. We just did our research to say, okay, we don't want to go separate to where the founder's heart. So what this is actually comes out of his heart, but he didn't have it defined because he was the person that you just looked to and you knew what the vision was because of who he was. But now for new people coming in, it needed to be explained. So our core values, and so we have 10, word-based, multiplying churches, interdependent ministries, new creation message, gospel of grace, stable spirituality, contemporary ministry, harmonious relationships, dynamic faith, selfless service. And then we have what our ministry focus is. So you can read all that stuff, and at the back is the declaration of faith that we've included. And you'll see a shorter version on page 9, but then there's the detailed version on pages 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, just to make sure that we really define how we are. So even when it comes to the sacraments, I don't even like calling them the sacraments, the ordinances, water baptism and communion. I've had a person who, in our church, who left because he thought we were not, our view of the ordinances was not Catholic enough, was not orthodox enough. He felt that Christ actually comes physically, spiritually, into the emblems. And we said, no, that's not our position. Our position is a Zwinglian position. Ulrich Zwingli from Zurich and Calvin, these guys were not even Lutheran in our position. Okay, so just take on, if you read the statement there on communion and water baptism, the Catholic position is that they call them the sacraments, because they have 7 of them, and it's the means by which you receive grace. Okay, it comes through Jesus, but there are 7 practical ways by which, that's why when someone dies, they've got to rush and quickly anoint them, otherwise they won't get to heaven. It's the sacrament of holy unction. Babies have to be baptized, and otherwise they're not Christians. But the moment that they're baptized, they become Christians. So my mum in the Orthodox faith, when I said I became a Christian, she goes, no, you were a Christian when you were 3 months old. I said, what do you mean? So the Greek Orthodox people, they baptise, the babies are naked, they hold them by the hand, and they stick them under 3 times and anoint them with oil. I mean, they really go for it. So we are, in our view, is we see that Jesus doesn't actually turn up and become part of the sacraments. Okay, some people believe that. And so the Catholic theology and Orthodox theology, they came up with a word called transubstantiation. And that's why the priest will never allow anyone to drink the wine. Because what would happen is if it's spilt, you're spilling the blood of Jesus on the ground. So you can't do that. So people are clumsy. So they've got the wafer, that they put it in your mouth, but then the priest has to drink it all afterwards, and not even 1 drop remains. And that's why so many become alcoholics. Some do. And so, but Luther, he came up with the term consubstantiation. We said, no, Jesus doesn't become part of the elements, but he comes and dwells in with the elements. So we're not trans, nor are we con. We take the position that they are symbols. Okay, they're just a piece of bread and a bit of wine. However, when we come together and the preaching of the word occurs, faith stirs in the hearts of people, and as they take the emblems by faith upon the expounded word, blessing comes. That's where people can be healed and saved, etc. So we've defined that very clearly because that's a big issue for people coming in. So that's our position. If you want to do some study on that, that's the position of a guy named Ulrich Zwingli, one of the great reformers from Zurich. And so he and Luther fought over this. They had a major conference and Luther swore at him, told him to get lost and you're a heretic. And that was Luther, German way. So when you look at the body of doctrine, there's a history. It's rooted in hundreds of years of reflection. The Trinity, the Godhead, all that was sorted out in the Council of Nicaea in 330 AD. The issue of Pelagianism about is it by grace or do we add to grace? All that stuff. There were 7 major ecumenical councils from 300 AD to about 700 AD, and whether you're Catholic, Orthodox or Protestant, we basically agree with those. So a lot of the issues regarding the Trinity, salvation, the humanity of Jesus, the deity, all that was sorted out. In this, it incorporates it all, without us having to say, you've got to read the Nicene Creed or you've got to study this. So that's why the historians, Barry Chant, Ken Chan, Mark Walker, Ian Miller, when they put this together, it's really well thought through. It's a classic Protestant, evangelical, Pentecostal statement. That's who we are, so we had to define that. And so the core values guide us. And we have a purposeful and prayerful, achievable ministry strategy. And that's why the movement every 5 years puts together a strategic plan. We basically vote on it, agree, as a CRC pastors and leaders, because again, if you are a denomination, you've got to be going somewhere. So it's a prayerful, purposeful, achievable ministry and mission goals and strategies. And so not all of them are achieved every 5 years. But at least there's some targets there. There's some faith targets, and we're inspiring our pastors and churches to be going. So one of the things that we've said for this strategic plan is we'd love every church to be planting a church within a 5-year period. We'd like every church to adopt a nation, at least, to actually be involved in missions. Everyone to be involved in supporting missions. Every pastor to be reproducing themselves and new pastors and leaders develop. So now with going back to your notes there, halfway down it says, when it doesn't make this natural shift and the charismatic leader or his successor becomes a dictator without a responsible, accountable, flexible organisational structure, it then becomes a sect. Now we, as a movement, when I talk about 1977 to 1985, don't get me wrong, lots of good things happened, but we didn't know whether we were going to exist organisationally as a movement. There were a couple of camps, and one of the camps was, let's centralise the whole thing, become like traditional denomination. And there were people speaking that way. We need all the properties, all the authority needs to be in a central office, a bit like the Uniting Church, the Anglican Church, the Catholic Church, and there's a couple of Pentecostal movements like the Apostolic Church, the Christian Outreach Centres. They have a centrally controlled structure. So there were pastors and leaders who were saying, we need to do something like that. There were others that were going, no. We just want to be independent churches, not autonomous even, and just want to fellowship together, just have meetings and conferences, but nothing else. We don't want anyone speaking into our lives as such, and we just kind of, let's just do our own thing and meet once a year for conference. And so they were the independents. So there's the independents and there's the dependents. Okay, so So they say, we want a dependent structure, we want an independent structure. And there were a whole bunch of us who said, no. We are the CRC. I got saved into the CRC. That was my denominational family. I thought, well, we are a family of churches, so we've got to work out some kind of organisational structure that allows for autonomy but endeavours to kill the independent thing. Because if you're independent, you might as well just be an independent church and not part of a denomination family. So autonomy is a good word. And dependence, we had to kill that word. And so the word that came in was interdependence. So we are autonomous, interdependent churches and ministers. And so, however, after Leo died, he was the president. Okay? And then what they said was, in the late 60s, early 70s, Leo was travelling around the world and they said, well, you're the inspirational leader. Let's form a Commonwealth, they called it then, now national chairman. And this person's appointed and they'll do all the organisational stuff and so that you're free to minister and all that stuff. Okay, so it was an administrative office. This was the spiritual, because he's the charismatic leader. He dies. The only person we had was the Commonwealth chairman. And he was an amazing person. He was a businessman. Okay? He actually was an incredibly good preacher, and I loved him dearly. However, he was a rough and tough businessman, and he wanted to create something, and the rest of the movement didn't really follow him. So it was difficult. And so what happened was, this administrative role ended up becoming a leadership role. And that's why to this very day, the leader of our movement, we call him the national chairman. We never changed it and said, oh, we need to call him president. We said, no, we don't want to do that. But it actually was an administrative role, and then it evolved into a leadership role. However, we couldn't get rid of the Commonwealth chairman. I think he saw his position as one for life. I think he did. And we couldn't get rid of him. There was no organisation and voting procedure to elect a national leader. And so from 1981, the date might be a bit wrong here. It might be 1980 to 82. We formed a constitutional committee to frame a national constitution. I happened to be on that. So was Dennis Slape, and then there was Kevin Drinkle from Victoria. There was 4 of us, I think. They got the younger ones. I was the youngest of them. So we thought, well, let's come up with a national constitution. Of course, it had to go to the state execs and national exec. And so we actually framed a national constitution. It was accepted, and there was a voting procedure, which meant the National Council would elect the national chairman. Before, it was appointed by a small group, okay, state reps. So basically, the movement, the executive of the movement was like a confederation. So the states would nominate a couple of people, each state, and they would become the national exec, and they would choose their own chairman. There was no direct voting by the majority of all the pastors as such. So we had to create this and come up with a voting system, because we had to get the national chairman out of office. So how do you do that? You come up with a constitution and you have a voting procedure to do it. We did it cleanly. It wasn't dirty politics. It was just like you've got to do it properly. So in 1983, we asked Pastor Cooper, would he stand for national chairman? And he said no. So then Russ Hooper stayed for another 2 years. Okay, it was really difficult. and then Dudley, then we said, and Dudley, you got to stand. We're losing pastors. We're going to lose churches. I said, you're a man of peace. The man of war has got to be put down. We've got to get the man of peace in there. And I loved Russell. I mean, we talked about this one through. He was not. So in 1985, Dudley Cooper became our first elected national chairman. But he had to stand against Russ Hooper, and that was the big issue. And so it was very difficult for Russell, and some of the things he recommended between 77 and 85 were good things. It's just the manner by which he would do it was always difficult, okay? And you can't run a movement like a business. And so Dudley was a great, wonderful, loving pastor. But he said to Mike Cronin and myself, he goes, I don't want this role. He said to us, I'm only going to be here for a short time. He goes, you guys have got to lead the movement. So Mike and I go, well, no, you're in it. So he only stayed for 3 years. And then Mike became national chairman and I became vice, 1988. I'm only 34 years of age. And so Mike and I were involved in that. But that was... So I'm just saying to you, we had to work to transform the movement to develop an organisational framework that was flexible. So now the issue of succession has been dealt with. Okay, we now have very clearly a voting process. We have a national chairman who's voted in every 4 years. We have a national vice chairman and an executive that's voted in every 2 years. And it's accepted that the vice chairman would become the chairman. That's the thing. So for myself, there's a sunset clause on my leadership. I've been doing it for 24 years. And Danny Parker, who's our vice chairman, he was with me at the national, for the leaders meeting that we had. He would be the obvious candidate to come into that role. So the aim, so we've actually, and a proper denomination has worked out its succession policy. Not only does it have a body of doctrine, clear vision and values, a strategy, but a succession and leadership development process. And so that's why we've actually evolved. I'll give you this because we could have fallen over very easily. Could have easily fallen over. And so that's just a little bit of the history. And look, it's probably a little bit of a biased history because it's my perspective looking in on it. And what I did quite a few years ago, I got all the previous national chairmen to write up an account. So I got Russell Hooper while he was alive. He wrote it up. Dudley Cooper, Mike Cronin, Neil Milne, and we've actually got, we're calling it Through My Eyes. How did they view it? It was really interesting read, how each person views it. And all of us have bias. All of us see it from our perspective. And so this is how I see it. And the facts are there. There's no doubt about the facts. It's the interpretation of the facts. So historical facts are historical facts, but the interpretations can vary from person to person. But basically, we've evolved. We now have 140 churches nearly in Australia, and we don't know how many we have overseas now. It is rapidly expanding. At the Christian Family Centre, our church is responsible for West Africa now. We've had meetings, 17 nations in West Africa that are looking, the leaders, to come into the CRC, and we're developing them. I've had Zoom meetings, and I'm going there. I'm going to Nigeria in a few weeks' time, and then to Ghana. And so Danny Parker's doing North Africa. So it's expanding. Where we've been, basically the Asia Pacific, now we're heading all over the place. Bruce Sharman starting churches in Canada. We've got a church in Walhalla. Can you believe it? That kind of was bequeathed to us, the property and that. So the movement now is a worldwide movement. And the structure that we have here in Australia, for example, in these African nations, we're actually saying the structure has to be similar to Australia, with order, responsibility, accountability, proper morality, proper set of beliefs and stuff like that. So we're trying to be very, very careful to make sure that the movement, as it evolves and develops, it develops with integrity. So it's 8 o'clock. Can I just say that I'll come back to this. I'll keep otherwise. The change from now 80 to 120 years is a significant time where things can go awry again. okay, because the Moses is gone and the Joshuas are going. So it's just the judges. And you know what happened there, don't you, with the judges? They didn't do too good. And so we're at the age where we're 81 years old this year, and so the transition of a movement evolving to be 120 years, the Joshuas now have got to do it right, do it really well, because there's another set of issues and problems that can develop. And when we'll have a break and I'll come back and I'll share with you what's happened in the Pentecostal scene in Australia. Movements that are collapsing. Okay, just some of them don't even exist anymore. I've been on the APMF since 1988, on and off. There were three movements that broke away from the CRC. 3 movements. One in 1957, one in 1974, and the other one in 1980. They don't even exist anymore organisationally as Australia-wide movements. Sorry, my apologies. One does. There's just 9 churches. And they had 50. They broke away because they wanted, we were too controlled. They just thought, oh, you're going for central control. They didn't read the values. They wanted independence. They got independence. It hasn't worked. So now they're looking at 40 years later, to do that. So you can see the pattern. So I'm talking about the revival centres no longer exist corporately as an organisation, as individual churches. The Intermen through Howe Oxley no longer exists. Bethesda has 9 churches. And they're good guys, but they were about 40. But they all split off in the... Perhaps the CRC is getting too controlling and we're getting too organised and all that kind of stuff. So if you don't do it right, you won't survive. It's as simple as that. You've got to be organised and have a flexible organisational framework. People say, organisation's a dirty word. No, it's not. Well, you imagine if you went to hospital and it wasn't organised. Imagine a hospital that's not organised. Imagine an airport that's not organised. It'd be absolute chaos. Organisation is important as long as it's your servant and not your master. Jesus is the master and he's got to spiritually lead. So there's got to be a proper and I call it a flexible, accountable, responsible organisational framework for longevity with the proper succession and voting procedures and all that stuff. Anyway, that's a little bit of, let's have a cup of tea and coffee. I need something to soothe my throat.
Thanks, Bill. Folks, we'll go out to the books, the books for sale. Who's running the Xbox, Okay, so there's some books for sale out there, and Bill will probably talk about this later. But if you've never read Legacy, it's all up to Harry. So let's go through that all. Mate.
I know, but I've just caught on you and Mike, the middle. Yeah. Okay, we're ready. Just give me a bit more power for my... One, two, three, four. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's it. Bit more power. That's great. Thank you. On what I've covered so far, I'm conscious I've been a bit all over the place before we got our notes, but are there any questions on this? I've tried to give you just a view of how we've evolved. I'll dig down a little bit further now. Any question, anything you didn't understand or want to raise? Well, it's not a paid position. No, it's not a paid position. It's a volunteer position. Some of our chairmen get a day a week. The movement covers them. Now he stayed on as part of the national exec, for he was pastoring a church, yeah, and so I got on very well with him. I didn't have any real difficulty. However, his approach to leadership at that particular time just didn't work. It just didn't work, and he got terribly hurt when Dudley stood against him, and that was unfortunate. But he overcame that after a period of time, and so we do honour him as somebody who did hold it together after Leo died, but just his style was one that just wasn't acceptable, and it was very difficult. Worked in the building industry, but not in the movement as such, particularly at that time. So, yeah. Any other question?
Was the chairman Russ Hooper?
Russ Hooper, that's it,
So
yeah.
he nearly 10 years in the game, so like he was there for
8 years.
77 to 1985.
That's right, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so, but it wasn't, the only time it was elected was in 1983. Once we brought the Constitution in, then we wanted Dudley to stand. We needed a change, and Dudley felt no. So Russ did get elected in 1983, the first time. So that's a correction. I thought Dudley was the first election, but that was the only time he was elected by the movement, as such, because there was no other candidate. And then of course Dudley stood. But yeah, so it was just circumstances, you know, like. That's why I don't blame Russell. He functioned well under Leo. But it was like here, the church, and because I was a witness to it, it was a terrible situation really, where the team fell apart and divided into factions, because they were all loyal to Leo Harris. But after that, they're saying, well, who's going to be the leader? And they didn't have a proper mechanism, decision-making process of how to even make the decision. That's how lack of organisational framework it was. They had to work out what percentage of the eldership could actually, was it going to be 10 out of the 14 or 9 out of the 14 that had to agree? And it just became an impasse for about a year and a half. Not quite a year and a half, but and so it became really difficult. And the factions, and so I know for myself, you know, I was, to me it was very obvious to a whole pile of us that Barry Chant was the logical candidate to become the lead pastor, and he would have had 80% of the support of the church. But there was a move by some people that to block him from being in that role. So Barry, being gracious as he is, he prayed and reflected, and as he went overseas, he just felt, well, look, I will let go. And the Bible College, if he was the principal, the dean, it became Tabor College, so good came out of it. but then, when they selected David Rodway, who is Leo's son-in-law, and I know David, I talk with him, he's in, you know, Canada, he's an older man now, but he had the ambition to lead the church, but he didn't have the support of the people. Brilliant man, but didn't have the spiritual ministry and personality type to actually, and so they selected Ian Simpson, and he was one of my pastors. I loved him dearly, beautiful man, terrific pastor, counsellor. However, it was putting a square peg in a round hole. Ian, I could say it, I'm only a young guy, leading in the Christian Family Centre, but he just didn't fire. And he ends up having a heart attack, a lot of pressure, but he also had the Harris family harassing him and putting pressure on him. It was a terrible time. So Ian didn't function too well, but at least he held the church together pretty reasonably. But then he let go of it, and so David became the leader, and the church just went, phew. And so it was really difficult. And so one of my most unpleasant tasks in being the state chairman at the time was when it collapsed, basically, and the elders and David, it just was unworkable. So I had to park myself here for a couple of weeks, actually, every day, every night, interviewing people, and I missed the national conference, Neil, back then, and it was just really difficult because the family basically tried to do a coup d'etat against the eldership team, and it was illegal. It was against the constitution. You just can't do it. So, but the elders were very gracious towards Pastor Harris because it's Pastor Harris's family, and I remember talking to David. And they would have had him back as their leader, even though the church had gone downhill, if he apologised for some of the things that he did. So he basically got up on a Sunday and said, they're all sacked. I'm replacing them all. They knew nothing. Like, he didn't have the power to do it. The eldership have the power to sack the senior minister, not the other way around. You know, it's like, I can be sacked tonight by my board. I can be sacked by the national executive. I wouldn't have it any other way. If you don't have... If you say you're a leader and no one's following you, you're just going for a walk on your own. You know, really, it's like there's got to be you've got to have the confidence. So David, I remember I was home and I was appealing to him on the phone, and Kathy was listening, and I still remember. I'm thinking, he's been sacked. They're going to reinstate him if he apologises. And I'm thinking, I said to the elders, I don't think you should do that, but that's their decision. He wouldn't apologise. He felt he was doing the right thing, and in sacking him en masse. I'm thinking, because he's the God-called man, but he didn't follow the process, you know. And anyway, so I'm the state chairman. Enjoy the confidence of the pastors. We've built a significant facility. Things are happening at Seaton, and he's given me a lecture on leadership. It was the most surreal thing. Like I'm a lot younger than him, but he's given me a lecture. Now, Bill, let me tell you about leadership. And I'm thinking, this is Nutsville. It's like, you're getting the sack. They're asking you to change, repent and apologise. You won't do it. You know nothing about spiritual leadership. I just said nothing. But I just thought, this is deception, that you've deceived yourself. If you really believe that you've got it and they've all got it wrong, it was crazy. And he wouldn't listen to me or anyone else. So, but at the same time, you've got to love. And so when he left with Bill, Hans and I took him out for a meal and we blessed them. And she gave me the photo I have in my office, which is really great. And so I keep in touch with them. We're looking at actually fixing up Leo's memorial, you know, the thing, because it's all washed away. And so I've been in contact with them. So you don't hold on to feelings, but it was just a really terrible time back then. And so the church went right down. And really, there weren't wise decisions made. And really, the church here was going right down until Neil came in and as the senior minister, letting go of a great concern at Port Life as he was leading, and really rescued the church. I really think it lifted after that. And then with the transition to Mike, it's now going gangbusters, eh? Yeah, he really mucked up financially. And it was dear Jeff Driscoll. I don't know if you remember Jeff Driscoll. Jeff was... who is that? Yeah. Reg Wilson. Yeah, you did go to Bible school with me. The face is familiar. That's why I thought, oh. Yeah, no, it's really sad, Mike, that kind of stuff. But dear Jeff Driscoll blew the whistle and basically said, you know, when he was looking after all the finance, do you remember all that, Neil, all the finances? And it was just catastrophic. And so the church was in a really bad way. And so what you see today is excellent leadership. Neil, Mike, a board that's properly structured and functioned and growing, and the schools and all that stuff. But we could have lost everything. We could have lost it all. The mother church of our movement. So it's a delight to see what's taken place. But it was terrible. Having been an eyewitness to it, and Hans Wortmann was another one that we several of us that were. So one of the things, a lesson for me was the factions to make the decision. I'm wanting Barry Chan to be the pastor, and there's some terrible stuff going on. I prayed and I said, God, I'm just going to go and speak to every elder, share what I feel is right, and then I'm going to shut up. I'm not going to say anything more. I don't want to be involved in politics. So I told them all, listen, guys, I said, I'm young, I'm only 23. I said, but can I just give you my honest opinion? I said, and now I'm not going to talk about this anymore. It's your decision. You have to give an account to Jesus for your decision. And and then I bowed out of it, and God called me to the Christian Family Centre, which is a little group back then. But it was, but I learnt the lesson to say, I don't want to get caught up in church politics, but you've got to speak your mind, you've got to be honest, go to the right people, then leave it at that. And so it was just very difficult. It was chaotic. One of the issues was it was raised that they should perhaps ask the national executive of the CRC to be involved in helping them make the decision about the appointment. And they said, no, we didn't appoint them. They'd have no input in our church. So it was this independent thing of, not wanting to submit to the constituted leadership of the movement. And so thankfully that tide has turned, and so most of our churches are really responsible. And, for example, St Agnes is turning around because you've been responsible in calling for help. Our Hope Church that had difficulties, we called for help. So being part of a denominational family is very helpful, to have people outside the church who are objective, can look in, and because once you're in a situation where it's difficult in an eldership and that, you can't be objective. You've got to have a neutral umpire out there, and that's why I believe in denominations, but good denominations, like we say, autonomous interdependence. And people have said to me, oh, you guys are just into central control and we don't want our church to be controlled by it. And I said, listen, I've never had an executive ever interfere in the Christian Family Centre. But I've said on many occasions, I'd welcome it. If I'm doing the wrong thing or heading in the wrong direction, I would welcome input and that. So this thing of, denominations are abominations and that, they just want to control the church, it's just not true. Not with the kind of structure that we have set up, the organisational framework, but we believe in accountability and making sure that people do the right thing, our ordained pastors and also our eldership teams. Any other question? I'll move on. Just to give you an example of, when I say organisational frameworks, there's two illustrations that I use. Back in the 1700s, you've all heard of John Wesley and George Whitefield, and amazing men. I love them. I still do. I've got all of John Wesley's journals. Amazing stuff. The modern Uniting Church wants to censor all that stuff because he had deliverances and baptisms in the Spirit and visions and dreams, but. Wesley was nowhere near as good a preacher as George Whitefield. George Whitefield was a brilliant preacher, gifted man, charismatic. He was cross-eyed, like people looking this way and the other eyes looking that way. And he was the funniest looking guy, but but his voice and his pathos, hundreds of thousands of people came to faith in the UK and in the Americas. He led the Great Awakening just before the Revolution. And we're talking about Jonathan Edwards, and if you know anything about the Great Awakening, it actually prepared America for the terrible colonial war. John Wesley was nowhere near as good a preacher, but by golly was he organised. All these new converts, he formed little connection groups, cell groups. And so Wesley was organised, planned. There are now 80 million Wesleyan church, 80 million people belonging to Methodist and Wesleyan churches across the world. And a lot of them are Pentecostal. There's no Whitefield churches. So you can be charismatic and anointed, but doesn't mean that you're going to actually produce and grow a movement that will carry it on. And I'm not saying a negative about Whitford, just didn't do it. Same as with Billy Sunday. He preached to 100 million people in the early part of the 20th century. Powerful preacher. He was a baseball player. The Billy Graham of the early 20s. 1920, 15. And then there's this little girl called Amy Semple McPherson. Okay, she marries this guy named Semple. They become missionaries to China. They arrive there, I think, in Shanghai, and he dies of typhoid within months, and she's pregnant. And she's called to preach. An amazing story. She goes back to America, and she's got this compulsion to preach. And but, you know, she didn't have a husband, and she had this baby. So she married McPherson, who is I think he was an accountant. Anyway, the marriage didn't work. And he didn't want to be travelling around the country. Anyway, so she married a third time. And that was a disaster. Okay, so it was like, she wasn't an immoral person. There's a lot of, but she was a genius in organisation. Not just a gifted preacher and healer. She built the largest physical church in America called Angela's Temple, could seat nearly 6,000 people. There's now nearly 9 million people that belong to the Foursquare movement with, I think, 70,000 churches in about 150 nations. One little girl. But she knew how to organise, she knew how to build teams. Sunday was a more powerful preacher, but there's no movement. So what I'm saying is, organisation and structure is not a dirty word, and it needs to be, but it needs to be our servant, and that. So that's why, if Pastor Harris came back and visited the CRC, he'd go, "What have you guys done?" You know, because back then, organisation, administration was a dirty word, like, you know, like control. You know, we've got to be free. And if he lived, I think he would have evolved. He was that intelligent. I think he would have evolved and understood there needs to be succession, needs to be proper order, but he never had the opportunity in that. So there's just a couple of examples of why it's important. Now, going back to my notes there, new established denominations face their biggest spiritual viability test when they transition to the third generation. Okay? This is 80 to 120 years. We've just entered that now. And so the CRC's evolution, I've mentioned about the book that I hope I will write and edit called Through My Eyes. It's another project. But they're the dates of our national leaders. And Russ Dudley. And Russell was a great man of God. I don't want to denigrate him in any way. It just he misfired and didn't function in that role, and the movement needed something different. And so each of these men have had an incredible input upon the whole movement, including Pastor Neil, Pastor Mike Cronin, Dudley Cooper, and Russ in his own way, even though it was a difficult period. But basically, we've only had 6 national leaders in the movement in 80 years. Now my role, I'm finishing 24 years this October, and I don't think that's going to happen again. I think that's a bit unreal for someone to be in the role for that long. I think probably 12 years would be great for someone to really have input, I think. So I think my own role, and when I write up the thing, is I think I was needed for a particular period, just my own calling and gift mix to lead the movement in particular ways that were needed. So I've regarded myself as a younger Joshua. You notice that? Neil is a middle Joshua, and Mike is a middle Joshua. The older Joshuas have gone to be with the Lord. So, and so this younger Joshua is finishing up too. So now we've got to move on to the next generation. What I've raised and been praying and reflecting and have spoken to our national exec, our national council in messages, is it's a dangerous era. Because when you look at the story of the judges, something went wrong. Moses transmitted to Joshua the vision, the values, the beliefs, the Ten Commandments, all that stuff. And Joshua was a magnificent leader, amazing leader. But then, and I think Joshua is realising something is amiss with this next generation. The first generation all died in Sinai. So it's the next generation. And so that's why he writes to them at the end. He warns them. You've got to follow what Moses, the leader, and you've got to obey. So what do you think? Why did they degenerate into almost becoming pagans within the Judges period? Is an awful book when you read it. I mean, like, they're sinning badly. When they're suffering, they call on God. He raises a deliverer. And these deliverers are imperfect. But this goes on for, I think, 250 to 300 years. So my challenge was, what really went wrong with the transmission? And I don't have a definitive answer, except I think comfort. They now possess the land. And the buildings, the towns, the crops were already made for them. They just took them over. Okay, so they're wanderers before. Now they've got their own plot of land, they've got their own house, they've got their food source, they're secure. And I think when you've been around for a lot, it's a bit like I see the Christian Family Centre, our church. There's a whole stack of people that are really comfortable. It's a really nice church, nice building, it's good pastors, let's say they're good pastors. And they get fed well, led well, fed well. They're getting fat and lazy. So I'm getting some thermonuclear devices and putting them under the seats. I want to blast them into orbit again. That's why the 50th was important. And so the series that we're doing and teaching, we're really wanting to fire that up. Starting the new church at Prospect with 100 of our people, that's put the wind up a lot of people. So 100 of our best people have gone to start a church with our blessing, and then at 10:30 you think, man, there's a lot of empty seats there. So you know what? We pray and we believe that God's going to fill them, and people are starting to come in. New people are getting saved. So putting a bomb under them I'm saying to them, and we're going to do 2 more churches. So I've already worked out where they're going to be. One's going to be east, and one's going to be between Glenelg and Brighton, probably Hove, around that area. So I said, I feel it, I smell it, I see it, I feel it. Who's going to be the pastor? I don't know. Who's going to go? I don't know. But I'm sowing that in them because I know they're fat and lazy, some of them. They're comfortable. And I've got to stir them up in prayer. They've got to pray. And I think that's what happened to that Judges generation. I think they just kind of like, oh yeah, we'll do the sacrifices. Yeah, we'll go to prayer. We'll read. I think they backslid. I think they just got lukewarm. And then they let the culture of the world come into the ship of the church. And it sunk them. So I think the CRC, we're a good movement. We've got some excellent churches. We've got some good structures in that. But I think the fire of revival and spiritual life has got to be the foundation. And that's why I'm thrilled about our World Missions vision to say, you know what, we want every church to be involved in World Missions. We want every pastor to be thinking about reproducing themselves to another pastor, every church to plant a church. So why say that? Because that, he says, okay, we need faith, we've got to believe. Otherwise, we want to be, this next generation, I don't want it to be the Judges generation, I want it to be the greatest generation. So really, our role, like Neil, myself, Mike, all of us, we're wanting to impart to make sure the next bunch of leaders, because they didn't know Leo Harris, they didn't know Russ Hooper, some of them didn't even know Mike Cronin, some of them didn't even know Neil Milne. I've been 24 years now, they've only known me a lot, half the pastors that have been ordained, so I'm thinking, okay, I'm not going to be around, I better make sure that I transmit the vision and the values and the heart. That's why we've done this with 5 keys of authority. We want every pastor, every person to actually go through it and get fired up with the authority of Christ, the authority of the believer, the new creation message. principles of faith. So that's a challenge that I think we're facing now, and I think we'll come through it, but it's one that I'm more conscious of, because I know that there's a sunset clause on my leadership, and we have to make sure that the next generation, the leaders that are right, men and women who are in their 30s and 40s now, that they're properly trained, really, and not just trained in theology, but trained in the vision and heart of the movement and its direction. So here's some, excuse me, some evolutionary changes. The first charter in 1972, this is looking at your notes. Leo Harris was smart enough, he took out any reference to the British Israel message out of the charter. Most of you don't even know what that is. When I came on the scene, they taught it in Bible college. And I'm doing historiography at university. That's my major, history. And I'm thinking, what is this BI stuff? And so I did all my research, Old Testament, New Testament. And the speaker, the teacher was hopeless. So I raised a question with him. And I said, if the 10 tribes, disappeared and they ended up as the Anglo-Saxon peoples, and none of the people who live in Judea, Palestine, were from the 10 tribes, how come it says in Scripture that Anna was from the tribe of Asa? She obviously knew that her heritage was in one of those tribes. So there were people that came back from Assyria and Babylonia, and they recognised their roots. A bit like I'm a Greek man. I call myself I'm an Aussie, but I'm a Greek Aussie. I can't deny my heritage. I speak the language. So she knew. Well, he went mad at me. He told me, that's an illegitimate question. Like, he really went nuts. He didn't answer me. So I went to Pastor Harris. I said, Pastor Harris, I said, listen, please, this teacher is terrible. I said, he's really not good. And I said, do I have to believe this stuff to be part of the CRC? And he says, no, you don't, because it's not part of our declaration of faith. But, so most of you have never even heard of the BI message. But in 1972 with the Charter, because he recognised Australia had become a multi-ethnic nation. When he started using the BI message was during the Second World War. There were no other races here. There were no Filipinos here. There were no Greeks. There were no Indians. Where are you from? You know, Pacific. They were just all Anglos. They just ate meat and potatoes. That's all they did. Boring, you know. And so God used the BI message to win thousands of people to Christ because the Japanese were ready to invade Australia. They'd already drawn the Brisbane line. And people were scared. They were uncertain. And so Leo would get up and preach, no, we're not going down because God has called Australia. We're part of the called people. And his wasn't a theology of race like BI. It wasn't like election of race. It was election of grace, and that the race has a responsibility to proclaim the grace of God. So he was very good. He was not a racist. But a lot of BI people are just flat out racist. And the guy that taught us in college was a racist and just was awful. And so, but Leo was smart enough, he adapted to realise, and I can't recall him speaking on the message in the 7 years that I knew him. So that's important because it shows that he would adapt and he would change and he would grow. I remember when he came across Yonggi Cho and Robert Schuller, two amazingly gifted men, and Leo was enthralled with them. And he went there and he learnt and he actually mastered their understanding of faith and possibility thinking with Schuller, and he was a learner. That's why I believe if he was in his mid-60s, early 70s, I think he would have evolved the CRC. But he was only 57 when he passed on because he was so smart and intelligent and always learning. But so the Charter in 72 took out that. The National Constitution, I've got here 1981-82 question mark. I've got to check out the documentation. I think it was 80 to 81, I could be wrong. The first direct elections, I've covered that. International missions focus. We the missions focus that the movement had really centred around Barry Silverback. That was our missions focus, Papua New Guinea, and then from there, the nations that developed there. So now, it's become a worldwide initiative. And that's a very thrilling thing because it's giving purpose to our movement. The expanded charter, I've gone through that, and you can read that yourselves. One of the major initiatives that we have done, which I think has helped transition the movement to become a properly functioning denominational family, is our credentialing process. Because the way the ministers are recognised. So when I was given a ministry credential, to be a pastor, this is how it happened. I go to the family centre, and things are doing well. Someone on the state exec goes, Bill's doing okay down there. I think we ought to give him a credential. Let's get him in. So I came in, talked, how you doing? I said, good. We hear good things. How's your marriage? Oh, all right. It really wasn't. It wasn't going too good at all. Oh, all right, and that was about it. And we had coffee, share. They gave me a credential. They didn't know what my marriage was like. They didn't know what my theology was. They had no. It just was hit and miss, and that's why a lot of men and women crashed and burned.
You got harder than me. I just got sent to me.
Because, okay. So, the competency-based regime I think, was a stroke of genius that we've done, and the author of that was actually Grant Redman. Some of you don't realise he was the pastor of our Stirling church, and he went and pioneered in Sydney. But Grant wrote me a long letter. When I sent that survey out in 2002 or something, or 3, he wrote back and said, "Have you considered this?" And I said, "I don't know, what are you talking about? We just believe in the survival of the fittest. Darwinianism, like you sink or swim, you're called of God and you got Jesus, that's all you need." So I was miles away. But basically, he argued the case well, and we as an exec kind of reflected on it. And so now there's a competency-based regime, so that somebody, let's say this young man, I'm not being prophetic, let's say you want to go into ministry, then you fill in an application form, you get 3 or 4 referees, it goes to our state credentialing team, and they say, okay, and then you start a competency trained program. So Mike or Neil or someone will put you through it. There's about 30 competencies. It might take 2 years. If somebody's an experienced leader, it might take a lot less time. And so it's to do with theology, knowledge of Scripture, leadership skills, ministry skills, character, the personal issues that we raise. So then that becomes the trainee minister. Then from that, the state minister is another 30 competencies and have a coach. Then the national minister is another 30 competencies. So we kind of think, if doctors are not allowed to touch people after 6 years, we reckon it should be a few years of training before we let people loose. And so, and even though it may take a shorter time for some people, like for example Janet Bryce, who was a foundation member of the Christian Family Centre, she was my assistant, she worked on the national exec, she came straight into a state minister's credential. She bypassed the trainee because she was so experienced, but she had to be competent in all those areas. And so it's not meant to be long, so hers might have taken about 1.5 years rather than, but it is a means by which we can really get to know the men and women who are being credentialed, and to make sure that they're sound and really well. And so we have in our questioning in the application form, it's fairly intrusive, the questions that we ask, and we have questions there on mental health, because a lot of people struggle with their health, and we need to know that. There's a horror story where there was a person who was brought forward to be credentialed, and they were mentally ill, but they were in remission from that illness, but it wasn't brought up. I was the state chairman then, and it wasn't mentioned in any form. There was no form. Well, this person crashed badly after being ordained, really badly, had to be hospitalised. And we're thinking, man, we need to know. Because, you know, the best thing may have been that person to be an associate pastor, but to put them in a leadership role with all the pressures, it just wasn't smart. And that's why we try and be careful on mental health, on making sure that the morality of people, their ethics and all that stuff. So that's something that has helped strengthen the movement. So the quality of minister now, I think, is very high in those areas. It doesn't replace the call of God and the gifting of God, and that's something that's really important. So that's one that has been a significant thing. We have policies and operational guidelines galore. They're about this thick. We have today at the APMF, Australian Pentecostal Ministers Fellowship, we had 2 consultants come in on how the heck can local churches handle the governance responsibilities, what the government is placing, federal government, state government, local government. There was one church that had 200 policies, one large organisation, 200 policies. And you need staff. It's really difficult. And for example, the schools are even worse than churches. The levels of policies so government is really intrusive, and so that's why the movement now. So we have policies and guidelines to help our pastors and our churches, but it's a really difficult. It's a difficult. For example, starting a church from scratch. So we've started Prospect, but all the governance things handled in the central office at the Seaton campus. So they're flying. They just have to preach and pastor and care, have to worry about all the other stuff. And so I just don't know someone starting a church on their own without connection to another church, a mother church with a strong umbilical cord, how that would work, because life is complicated today. And it's you just take a duty of care with kids. You take work, health and safety. These are really huge issues. Then you've got grievance policies. You've got there's a whole pile of stuff so we're talking today 2 pastors that have been taken, not to the cleaners, but allegations made against them, grievances over nothing issues. Over nothing issues. So someone exercising leadership, you know, like I'm correcting you for, I don't know, you did something and I corrected you. Well, he cries he's been bullied. So he wants money from the church. And the tribunals will only listen to him, and it costs you thousands of dollars. That's a different kind of ball game to the 70s and 80s. And so this is happening across our Pentecostal movements. So therefore, governance and policies and guidelines, you've got to be really clear, and that's becoming onerous. And as a movement, we're endeavouring to grapple with that and to help all our churches on that one, particularly the smaller churches that struggle with it. So that's just part of denominational life. Questions, because it's 9 o'clock. Anything that you want me to elaborate on? Did I give out this one? Yes. This one here. Yep. This one here, we also put together an international directions where we say to all the nations where the CRC is in, we're saying, we in Australia cannot impose what their strategic direction will be. We can only say, look, let's help you come up with a template, you actually fill it in, because you know the needs in Papua New Guinea are different to say Nepal or Tanzania or New Zealand, etc. So the movement across the world is also following this to say, okay, we need to look at, you know, targets of church planting and ministers and stuff like that. So that's another document that we do that every 5 years as well. So this brightly coloured thing, and you'll see there's a message from Barry Silverback, Phil Kaiser, myself, and then we basically ask all of our various nations to have input, and then we put this together, but it's now for them to actually flesh it out. So we've got a strategic plan on the international level. How well it goes, that's the question, because some nations really struggle. For example, I go to the National Executive Council of Papua New Guinea when they have their meeting. I usually have a day with them. We talk about strategy, and it's a different ball game. They just don't know. Somebody will get saved, and they'll go and plant a church the next week. He's got 50 people, but he knows nothing. He just knows Jesus as his saviour. So, and then that church might close. There might be some. So every nation is different in how it operates culturally, and so and the unique issues they have. Like, you know, in Papua New Guinea, I did some lectures on domestic violence and sexual abuse. Do you know that 2 out of 3 women in Papua New Guinea either get sexually abused or beaten? That's 66%. That's the United Nations research, and we met the United Nations lady who's actually, it's horrendous what's taking place there. And that's not, and in Africa, it can be as bad. And so there are unique issues, social, moral, ethical issues that these nations have to face. I mean, Australia's bad too. We have one woman killed basically a week by her partner. So domestic. So we think 1 in 5 women in Australia get sexually abused in their lifetime. 1 in 7 men. 3 of my pastors, Christian Family Centre pastors, were sexually abused as little boys. Men are starting to talk about it now, but they'll start talking about it in their 60s and 70s, whereas women talk about it when they're in their 20s and 30s. So these are issues that somehow, you know, getting the data is really important. The rise in occult practices in Australia. Do you realise that occultism is increasing? White magic, witchcraft, all that kind of stuff. So therefore, every country is different. So your strategic direction has to be targeted to try and meet those needs. And so that's why every nation has to do its thing under the guidance of what we provide. So that's a little bit about the CRC. Read the material. Read Leo's book. Well, it's not his book. We've put it together. His book's and I think that'll be helpful. And also Flames of Revival, Dudley Cooper's. It's a very thrilling read, actually. You get very excited and think, oh, God, just keep doing this stuff for us. Well, thank you for being a good audience. Sorry that I'm being a bit crook, but I think we've covered a fair bit. Let me pray for you. Father, thank you for people who are keen to learn and grow and become more Christ-like and want to be empowered to want to serve you more effectively in their local church. Bless them. May some of the things that I've covered resonate and help them in their journey of understanding their church, understanding their denominational family. Bless them now. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you guys.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bill. Grab some books, grab some material. If you want extra copies of that stuff, go for it. Now, our next gathering is Saturday morning, the 27th of June, okay? Saturday morning, the 27th of June. So just to make sure you got that noted in your calendar so you don't miss that. And that'll be here at Sturt Street. Pastor Mike will be sharing, and then I'll be starting a series. So Saturday morning, 27th. Other than that, tables down the back with some books. Thank you guys for your help, and God bless you. Have a great evening.